I found, Gabriele, thanks for your talk, and interesting to see David's old data as it relates to butyrate production and what really was, I guess, a proxy for molecular weight or particle size with fine and moderate. What's interesting there, though, is that higher particle size, and I think you touched on this, tends to be associated with higher viscosity and lower postprandial glucose, certainly with beta-glucan, and lower cholesterol with beta-glucan. We see that with high, we did a meta-analysis where we saw higher molecular weight and more cholesterol lowering, so more intact. You'd see this, like, for example, in a steel cut oats versus an instant oats, where you would get that higher molecular weight with steel cut oats. So just, there's a bit of a difference there depending on whether you're looking at short chain fatty acid production and, I guess, availability of substrate for short chain fatty acid production, and then the other physiological effects of the fiber in terms of viscosity. Just maybe a comment on that.
Well, I think the first thing is we're looking at two different length scales here. It's not just particle size here, but we're talking about molecular weight of the actual fiber. Simon Balance's group in Norway have done some interesting work looking at that there's a cut-off in terms of physiological benefit in terms of molecular weight. How that then relates to particle size and structure, I think, is something we really don't know very much about.
Right.
But yeah, beta-glucan's an interesting one.
Yeah, we saw it at 300 kilograms per mole, where we saw the difference above that. You saw reductions, and it was almost stepwise once you got above 1,000 kilograms per mole. Okay, interesting. And I just have one follow-up.
Sure.
Just, reviewing, and Marianne, you sort of touched on UPFs. Of course, the addition of fiber to food makes it a UPF, and you touched on that too. And explicitly called out in the FAO document the addition of insoluble or soluble fibers. So I guess all brand buzz with psyllium would be an ultra-processed food, David. So just a remark on that.
In relation to your first question, I think we... Can you hear me? Yes. In relation to your first question, we should consider when we talk about dietary fiber, we are talking about dietary fiber linked with some starch. You get pure dietary fiber only if you extract dietary fiber, but in the fruits, when you measure the amount of dietary fiber, you are measuring amount of fiber linked with some resistant starch, which has not been digested because of the conformation of the food in the small intestine. So, in the gut, you have, first of all, fermentation of this starch, which is linked with the fiber. And if the structure of the food has been in some way changed because of the mastication and so on, it is easier and more quickly digested. And then the bacteria are going also to digest the dietary fiber themselves. That's why it is important to consider that, for instance, the relationship between the size of the fiber, which is better if it is small in terms of fermentability. It's very solidly demonstrated with wheat and in general with all cereals, but it's not being demonstrated with legumes, probably because legumes, even if they have a larger particle size, have a composition of the fiber which is easily attacked by the gut bacteria. So the gut bacteria don't make very much difference in a large particle size or a small particle size if you are considering legumes. But with wheat and other cereals, the particle size is important because in that case it's more easily attacked by the gut bacteria, particularly the starch, which is still linked with so it's all a complex issue that we need to understand a little bit more as long as we go on.
Can I just try and oversimplify this? If you nibble, and I think John knows this very well too, if you nibble versus gorge, you get a very different effect. That's what we're seeing basically when you can break down things. It doesn't matter how you break it down or what the reasons are, but if you can break down the carbohydrate rapidly, you get rapid absorption, you get rapid increases in insulin. If you nibble, you get very slow effects. If you gorge, you get large effects. So I really do think that we ought to try. I'm all in favour of complicating things by calling them fibres, but I'm all for simplifying physiology as best one can. Thank you.
Professor Young?
I totally agree with dietary fibers. Use this name to replace dietary fiber. Another question for me, because in our countries we have a lot of synthesis, 生物合成.
Synthetic and added fiber.
It's not fiber. It's,
They use the name
yeah,
added fibers.
the industry want to use the name functional carbohydrate replace dietary fiber because for the industry synthesis 生物合成的比较多啊，就是
Right, including synthetic starch, you can actually make.
maybe, but I mean it's not natural from food the dietary fibers. So I want to ask Dr. Jenkins and the second speakers. So do you think it's same dietary fiber as almost the same with the functional carbohydrate? The name.
Yeah, that's actually a good question that reminded me almost like 20 years ago now, really is that 2005 to 2006, Gabriel, said David or Tom, several of us serve on the WHO and FAO Committee for Dietary Carbohydrate. And similar question was raised, particularly related to synthetic or added fiber, that obviously industry would love a clear definition that's on chemical based, and then they fit into the dietary recommendations of increased fiber intake. And there's been some data suggesting that actually increased carcinogenesis with some of the fibers, and that's concerned. But I haven't followed the recent literatures on that. Actually, this is actually a very good. So along that line is Marianne's idea about this sort of like a new report from the group. I think it would be a great idea. But okay. Walter.
Thank you. Those were so many very interesting presentations. But just to pursue that specific comment a little bit, the issue of synthetic and purified fiber is a very practical issue because I think as many people here know, the U.S. FDA allows those to be included on the line on nutrition facts as fiber, along with your intact whole grain fiber and other forms of fiber, which has concerned some of us quite a bit because the fiber that's removed, and the removal of fiber by refining, of course, removes most of the minerals and vitamins. Right. So it's really not the same. But even with among very different synthetic fibers, there's huge heterogeneity, of course. So purified fibers is what you've shown, which is really important. So if we do make some comment about that, something about the synthetic or purified fibers would be something to consider. I don't know if anybody else has a comment about that. But one other comment was related to one of the comments that Gabriele made about the individual responses to fiber in terms of short-chain fatty acid production and huge variability, and the comment that it took for some people 8 or 9 months to really see the full effect, which does make me wonder, while the short-term studies we can learn a lot from them, ultimately, if we're going to move to human diets or recommendations, or maybe some really bread that would be much healthier in terms of both fiber content and GI, that we probably need, do we really want to have a standard of, say, a year's duration of studies because of the, we may be misled by some of these short-term studies. As we were with the whole dietary fat and weight control, something seemed to shift at about 6 months very consistently, and we got misled by short-term studies. So just some general thoughts about that.
General thoughts about short-term studies. I think they do pose a problem. We do have problems with nutrition and having long-term nutrition studies where there's good adherence. That's been the problem. And the immense expense that one has to put in. Worthwhile, I agree, and we should be trying this. But if we fail this, then I think the long-term studies, such as you've been doing, Walt, where you can look over a period of someone's lifetime, not randomized controlled trials, but prospective cohort studies. I think these are very valuable, and they're becoming extremely valuable in terms of the drugs we use, because now we're finding that many of the drugs that we use routinely have, for example, carcinogenic properties that were not discovered in the short-term FDA-approved trials, but now are appearing in the longer term. So I do think long-term studies are tremendously important, and it's something that I think will make us all somewhat more reserved in doing things with new products that are engineered in some particular way. And I've even been worried about things like psyllium and guar, simply because they're purified, and I don't know what the long-term consequences are. But physiologically, they do show benefit in the short term.
In the short term, that's the reason why glycemic index is so well in terms of capturing almost like a bioassay. Jenny?
I have a question that could go first to David, but I'm happy for anybody to answer it. What do you think of the fact that the amount of fibre that's recommended is 30 grams a day? Is it adequate? Is it a joke? Is it something we should try to change as a group?
That's actually a very good question. We were just related to that 2000, I think Waterboy and both David and Walter know that 2005, the IOM, you guys come up with that minimal dietary reference that the whole world seemed to adopt, at least the world that I am familiar with. Even that is like, sometimes I feel like come out of thin air, that 100 gram minimal carbohydrate intake, and then fit in that context, you make 30 grams of, so what is the minimum? That's the minimum. That seems to me, it doesn't make sense. There's obviously a lot of work that need to be done still.
I think that one's got to think about healthy, sustainable diets. And if one can put healthy, sustainable diets together that work in populations, what are the levels that they're finding are useful for them? I don't think that there should be necessarily a fibre standard. The only point that one can say that may have some benefit is that by saying increasing fibre intake, at least we are increasing along what we think is the right path. But I think, to give a number, quite right, Jenny, I wouldn't want to put my name to a number, although I've been forced to do so.
Can I tell you why I want this question answered? That in Australia, people in their 30s and 40s, particularly men with young families, are dying of colon cancer. And our average intake of fibre as a population is higher than most countries. It's up around 25, 27 grams a day. So is it because they're not feeding their colon? And can we say something about the relationship of higher amounts of fibre to colon cancer?
Or do they have increased beef consumption?
Can I make a quick comment there? From a public health perspective, a very simple message is we want to digest our food from our mouth to our anus. And it's quite a sort of graphic thought, but that's actually what we're really aiming for. And it's so difficult to communicate that complexity of science, but that will help people think about what they actually need to do to actually have that constant digestion throughout the entire digestive tract.
I think that if you consider the impact of fiber on the glycemic index, then it has to do probably with the relationship with the amount of carbohydrate. If you have an higher carbohydrate content, then you need more fiber to delay the absorption of this carbohydrate. But if you consider fiber as a whole, particularly in the fiber from whole grain, for instance, perhaps Dr. Willett can clarify this issue. The epidemiological evidence indicates that about 50% of the cereals that we utilize, 50%, if we in the intake of this of cereals is all grain, you reach almost the maximum benefits in terms of reduction of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. That's why in the Eat Lancet, this is in a way proposed. Okay, it is better to have 100% all grain, but if you reach 50% of all grain, I think you get the best in terms of reduction of the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. What do you think?
Yeah, it's actually been, there's been a sort of paradox here, and I don't have a clear answer to that. Most, there does seem to be a nonlinear relationship. I think you're quite right. But to get a lot of data, and when you have a nonlinear relationship, getting tight confidence intervals around the various points, it really takes a lot of good data. The most benefit, the slope is steepest early on. One of the paradoxes that we've wondered about for a long time is that for colon cancer, the US data do not really show a relationship with fiber intake, but many of the European studies do show some relationship. And I think it's, in the last few years, we've realized that there probably is a simple explanation in that the US, we get most of our fiber from actually refined grains, ironically, because they're a big part of the diet. And so if we look at colon cancer, the whole grains versus refined grains actually is quite strongly related to colorectal cancer, which of course practically means consuming more of our grains as whole grains, but it does mean just in analyses we need to, at least for colon cancer, look at refined grains and whole grains, or fiber and other forms of carbohydrate at the same time to make sense out of what seems to be a paradox. But in Europe, the contrast is that much more of the fiber does come from whole grains, of course, than with less refined grains. So it boils down to something actually a pretty simple explanation of that paradox, it seems. But to go back to Jenny's comment, that why is there an increase in colorectal cancer in many countries around the world? We could talk about that as a separate issue. We do see some things that are really, I don't think there's a simple explanation. That overweight is clearly, increasing obesity is definitely part of the problem. And we do see that higher increases in sugar-sweet beverage during adolescence and earlier life is part of the problem. We've actually probably increased our fiber intake during recent years, so I don't think that the time trends don't fit with that. Ironically, one thing that seems really interesting, and I just toss it out because it was hard to publish originally, but it's published. There are now 3 studies showing that actually being breastfed after birth is a risk factor for colorectal cancer, which, of course, there was huge resistance to publishing that, but we looked at it because it was seen in the UK women's study. We saw it in Nurses 1, and we saw it in Nurses 2. So I think it's real. Overall, the big picture doesn't change. Breastfeeding overall is good, but this does fit the time trend. So it's the understanding that could help us perhaps unlock some deeper understanding of the etiology of colorectal cancer. There's multiple hypotheses that hypotheses or mechanisms, but it's something that seems to be part of the picture as well. So
But why is breast fat? What do you think might be the underlying mechanisms?
Some of them is there, first of all, that there's something missing in the breast milk that's not as good as the formula milk.
Interesting.
And there's a lot of work that's gone into optimizing formula milk, and then you look at what mothers are eating, and it comes out in their breast milk, a lot of trans fat, probably inadequate amounts of lots of things because of maternal diets.
Right. So
Or could there's been also hypotheses about vertically transmitted viruses too.
yes. So we actually follow a Chinese birth cohort and find out that some of the metal elements, some of the pollutants actually go through the breast milk. So in that sense, there might be some of the EDC, perhaps the endocrine disrupting chemicals is there too. That might be another possible hypothesis, particularly in more recent times. So that actually the formula is cleaner in that sense. So, and related issue, I want the panel to also adjust to, following up on Walter's suggestion of looking at this holistically and in an integrated manner, is the energy balance. So I want Peter and balance your works. Would you control energy at the food level? It's almost not like it in your experiment. And that because some of the sort of large, high quality prospective cohort studies have shown clearly there's some differences in terms of sex differences between men and women. We see that. And then some of the recent works that I'm aware of, like Professor Yang's group, in short-term feeding trials, trying to understand carbohydrate requirements, and clearly see these post-absorption differences between men and women. So I wonder whether or not in your studies you see some of those effect modifier.
Well, first, we definitely match for energy.
I see.
But most of these postprandial studies, our sample size is probably too small to get any meaningful data out of splitting genders. We're trying to match the amounts of men and women in the study. But if we're talking 20 participants, we haven't seen any differences, but that doesn't mean that they're not there.
Can I go back to Walter and Walter's comment
Sure,
about the looking at refined versus unrefined? I think that doesn't really show a lot, because when you're refining grains, all you're doing is taking the outer pericarp layer off. You're not actually necessarily breaking down the cellular structure. So when you've got something like semolina, where you've still got that cellular structure in there, you've got much slower absorption of the starch, and some of that will go through to the colon. So I think, on the whole, the majority of our so-called refined grains actually have the entire cellular structure broken down, but they don't all. So then we have questions like, what's happening with pasta? Why is it so good in the Mediterranean diet? Why is it so important? And that is because you've still got cellular structure, even though you don't have the mineral and the cutins on the outside of that particular thing. So I think it's much more nuanced, and you've got to think about how that sort of changed the way you're thinking about what is a refined grain, what is actually the type of fibre you want to eat. Do you want to keep your starch, as Gabriella says, enclosed within those cells, which I think is our aim, and just adding cutin back in, which I know there's a slight difference in linguistics here from UK to the US between wholemeal and whole grain. I think they're two very different things, but I do think removing that bran layer or the cutins it's not going to have any impact in real life on the physiology. So it's something you're not going to be able to tell from the food tables.
Well, part of the physiology, but not.
Yeah.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
There's lots of
Yeah,
effects of fiber we already heard.
yeah,
And
exactly.
minerals and vitamins.
Yeah,
too, so-
but I think this fermentation,
Dimensions, I think.
yeah, I think it's much broader than by doing this broad sweep, you're losing the science. And that, I think, is quite important.
So I'm going to turn this to Alan, because Alan is raising his hand.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we have time. I'm going to keep this going. It's such an interesting,
Good
but we do have, for those of you who wanted to jump out there and grab refreshment, that's also possible. Alan, go for it.
A quick practical question, and thank you all for your presentations, they've all been great. You've convinced me, but I guess that's not a surprise that we need to talk about dietary fibres as David kicked off. And it might sound like a semantic thing, but well, first of all, dietary fibre isn't mandated in nutrition information panels around most of the world. It's not in Codex Alimentarius as a required element, so that's global. In Australia, it's not mandatory. It is in a couple of countries in the world, and that's just dietary fibre, not dietary fibres. So maybe we should be talking to the Codex people and get in early and talk about dietary fibres and at least get that discussion happening, because I think otherwise it's very academic for your average consumer. And as Jenny pointed out, Australia does quite well. We don't have a mandatory fibre listing on our nutrition information panel, but we do eat quite a large amount of it. But I think we need to think about the practical side of this, communicating it to consumers. If we don't even list dietary fibre, how are we going to be talking about all these different types and get them to be eaten?
Yeah.
And going one step further, we could come up with a short-chain fatty acid fecal index, and we could assess, say for 2 weeks, breakfast with that food, that particular food you're testing for 2 weeks. This was breakfast every morning, and then you could measure the change in fecal pH in a group of 10 healthy individuals. Because in the end, I think it is the production of those short-chain fatty acids, one of which is butyrate, which is the cellular energy source for the colonic cells and prevents them differentiating into cancer cells, that might be the physiological mechanism.
That's one of the reasons why current dietary recommendations are focused on foods rather than on nutrients, because probably you can have two different diets with the same nutrient composition but with different impacts on health. So you should select the type of food which is associated with the lower risk. And that's some way linked to the nutrient composition, but also to other aspects which relate to the food structure, to the way it is cooked. For instance, fish has a different impact, it seems, on cardiovascular disease in eastern country or in a western country. It depends on the way you are cooking it. So food is much better to consider as a tool that we should recommend in our dietary guidelines.
Just like the glycemic index, you test the whole food, okay? And often that's the whole food you eat for breakfast, like oats.
Yeah, this kind of, I obviously my own bias, probably folks in this room's bias, and glycemic index, the way it's constructed, is really like a biological assay, the way I see it in vivo, even though without, doing the whole processes of food productions all the way down to consuming by individuals that reflected in the glucose response. Is there any other, and it's actually now very simple with the 24-hour glucose monitoring that we can continue to pick it up, even refine this concept going forward. I wanted to throw this to the audience because I have seen some data coming out from Professor Yang and Sean's group where they're pretty creatively using some new 24 hours non-invasive monitoring of, like, for example, ketone body, like beta glutarate. Some of those related, are there any new kind of sort of like technologies or possible similar to the glycemic index kind of development from the carbohydrate perspective, that it's non-invasive, and then have this kind of, this is something that we should perhaps encourage more moving forward.
Walter, regarding, just a comment, Walter, regarding your comment on dietary fiber in Europe, I remember the case control studies from Carlo. I think you found that most of the grain fiber was from refined, so-called refined grains in Italy, so that's also true. And the WCRF guidelines for colon cancer, in fact, do not anymore show dietary fiber, but now they show whole grains as a food that lowers the risk of colorectal cancer, so it goes along these lines. And I think, Jenny, I think totally, I would support you on that particular study or line of studies on short-chain fatty acids. I think it makes a lot of sense from the evidence that is present, and butyrate has also been found that can have epigenetic regulation, so that has a lot to do with cancer and also with cancer drugs, which some of them show resistance, and but with more fermentation, certain type of bacteria, these drugs work better. So that's another evidence. And I think we should definitely increase, try to advocate more dietary fiber in the diets of healthy people and non-healthy people or patients, because what I see is only health effects. The health effects are huge on cardiovascular and also cardiometabolic diseases, but also in oncologic diseases. So I think we should really maybe think about writing also a paper on the dietary fibers that Dr. Jenkins proposed, and of course contact, as Alan said, the institutions who can actually render all this a little bit more available to everyone, to the for public health.
David, and Carlo, you have something to say?
Well, at least part of fibers came from fruit and vegetables as well. But in our study, and Gord already mentioned the difference between European and American studies, in our studies the inverse relation between fibers and colorectal cancer was rather strong, even in the 90s.
Yeah, this is really a concern. I think the Chinese too. I really wonder, Professor Yang and Sean comment on it. I see a tons, like the amount of refined grain that labeled as whole grain in the market is just unbelievable in China now. In fact, they also hop on the glycemics bandwagon, have a way to make those refined synthetic or added fiber, make it in so many different ways. Whole grain bread has low glycemic index. So this is actually one of my concerns. I kind of want the two of them show, because they have been actually doing the most testing of the sort of like glycemic index database in China, and yet now, even from the industry perspective, they also set up their own labs to sort of like jump on these bandwagons of low glycemic index and testing their products. So would you mind comment on that, Professor Shah? Oh, yeah. No, I don't want to comment. Is this not going to... Well, go ahead, Alan.
Can I make a comment? We don't regulate what whole grain is either, and I suspect it might mean something different in China as it does in my country, as it does in your country. So maybe part of the bigger picture is, how we define fibres, how we define whole grains, and talk about it globally. And that's where, again, Codex Alimentarius is probably our best port of call to filter down throughout the globe.
David, you have the last one.
Thank you. I just want to share with you something I found interesting. Semolina. It's if you like, a semi-refined product, I think one would be able to call it. And yet, semolina is what traditionally pasta has been made with. And And that's why pasta, because of the semolina context, in that it remains an integral part of the grain, even with the fibre deprived, it still has a low glycemic index and low. So, and it doesn't matter whether you feed it as whole grain or refined pasta, white pasta, it's still low. It's about half of what bread is, either white or brown. So I do think that there's more to the whole grain story, more to the fibre story than just the fibre. But the actual intactness of the particles is important.
And
Thank you.
Can I just say comment there too? The reason why semolina, why wheat can be broken down into nice tight little particles like that is because it's made from hard wheat. You cannot do it with a soft wheat, which is what you use for making cakes and biscuits. And hard wheats can be milled so that you take off just the bran and not the alurone layer. And the alurone layer has all these micronutrients. That's why pasta's yellow. And these micronutrients are helping to protect us when you get a glycemic response. So one of the reasons why I think soft drinks are so associated, linked with disease, is because they're glycemic without any micronutrients. They're completely empty. And so the answer is not necessarily to say don't drink a soft drink, especially if you're allowing alcohol every day, 2 or 3. Maybe the answer is that you regulate soft drinks and all refined cereals so they contain the original micronutrients in the plant.
Jimmy, can I ask if we can buy hard wheat bread as opposed to soft wheat bread?
Yes, you can.
I've never seen any hard wheat bread. I'd be very interested to see
You
how it
don't
tastes.
call it that, David, but it depends on your country. So Australia has a lot of high quality, high protein wheat, and our bread would be hard wheat in general. But you don't label it on the food, so you're right. There's no way you would know, and it would depend on what your country is producing and getting, and it would vary throughout the
In
globe.
southern Italy, we produce hard wheat bread.
Yeah, bread has to be hard.
Yeah, guys, I know it's exciting. Sorry to interrupt, but thank you for all this input. But let's take a 25 minutes break, refreshments, and don't get soft drink though, right? That's coffee. And come back in 25 minutes.
Don't sweeten it.
So if you don't